So as I mentioned, Germany is probably the country that is the most responsible for the First World War beginning, because of course Germany would not dissuade Austria-Hungary from war, in fact encouraged them, and sought for itself to use war to seize territory and expand its power in Central Europe. Germany also invaded Belgium when they attacked France, which was a violation of Belgium's sovereignty and also the reason that the United Kingdom became involved in the conflict. But once that's the case, what brought the United States into this war? For the United States, there were two really major factors that were connected. And one of them was Germany's Naval War. Germany was using U-boats or submarines in what was known as unrestricted submarine warfare. This is connected to the United States because the policy of the United States at the time is neutrality. And there were two kinds of neutrality that you could have. You could have a neutrality where you just simply stop trading with any belligerent power, or you could have a neutrality where you said, we're a neutral country, we have freedom of the seas, we have the right to freely trade with anybody we want to, regardless of whether or not they're at war. The United States, of course, under Woodrow Wilson, chose that option, chose free trade, freedom of the seas. Woodrow Wilson asserted that the United States had the right as a neutral power to trade with any country it sought. And if he had chose the other route, to not trade with any of the belligerent powers, it would negatively affect the American economy. So Wilson says, we're open and happy to trade with anyone. We're not involved in the war, and we'll trade with any power. There was a sort of, the United States certainly leaned towards the British orbit, but it sought to maintain that type of neutrality. Well, the problem with that is, as you can kind of tell from this map, this would be France, over here is Germany, but you can kind of imagine Norway and Sweden are over here, Denmark's over here. You can kind of imagine Germany has a lot less coastline. The British are the preeminent naval power. And so for the British, blockading the German coastline is really primarily about this area right in here in the North Sea. The British Navy was stationed up here in the northern reaches of Scotland, actually, at the time, much of it at least. And so Great Britain is blockading Germany. This means that no American supplies of a meaningful amount are coming to Germany. By default, the United States will be trading almost exclusively with the United Kingdom. This effectively makes the United States' neutrality policy eventually look like ineffective alliance with the British. Germany, in dealing with this, began using something called unrestricted submarine warfare. This was a really controversial tactic for Germany. It was controversial because, it was controversial within the German ranks of the Navy. Because what this meant is that Germany was going to use its submarines, its U-boats, to sink any vessel without warning that it deemed to be a potential threat, a potential, a potential sort of transport of military equipment, supplies, anything related to the war effort. And so what this means is that the shipping going to United Kingdom here is all being targeted by German U-boats. The first case of a really, really controversial sinking of an ocean liner was the sinking of the Lusitania, which killed 1,198 passengers and several hundred more of the crew. This is the Lusitania right here. It was sunk off the southern coast of Ireland. It's right down here. Now, this is the newspaper advertisement and notice for the Lusitania. And this is telling travelers that you're sailing into a war zone, basically. In addition to this, it should be noted the Lusitania was carrying supplies for the war. It was actually, on its ship's manifest, it was actually listed as a military transport and supply ship. So it was carrying military supplies, and Germany would argue that sinking this ship was a justified sort of military target. But of course, all those killed, these individuals killed, are civilians. Over 100 of them were Americans, too. And so the British and the United States very much presented this as, you have attacked a civilian ocean liner. It's seen as like the way in the 21st century an act of terrorism would be seen. After the sinking of the Lusitania, the United States does not declare war. The Lusitania's sinking does not make the United States get involved in the war. This is 1915. President Wilson is getting ready to campaign for another term as president. He is positioning himself as a peace candidate who's going to keep the U.S. economy going but keep the United States out of war. And Wilson basically said, look, the United States is a neutral power, should be allowed to trade freely with whoever it wishes to trade with. He said if Germany continues unrestricted submarine warfare, that the United States might cut off diplomatic relations, which would be a step towards war. Was this form of neutrality practical? And that's a big question, because on the one hand, Woodrow Wilson's neutrality, which is the United States reserves the right to effectively trade and interact with whatever powers it chooses to, and it's happy to sell things to Germany or France or Britain or whoever it may be. That policy of open trade and freedom of the seas during a time of world war was a policy that, if the war was a long drawn-out war, as it was very likely, because of this naval war, was very likely to pull the United States into the conflict. On the other hand, if the United States just says we're not going to trade with any of the belligerent powers, then you have the situation where you're probably going to see a very negative effect to the American economy. So it's a very difficult decision. And eventually, this neutrality is responsible largely for pulling the United States into the war. Now, initially, Germany responded to this and said, okay, we will stop unrestricted submarine warfare. And Germany actually stopped carrying out unrestricted submarine warfare for a little bit over a year, hoping that they could end the war on the continent before that time, before it was necessary to potentially resume this. Of course, the war was a stalemate, and a war of like massively horrifying, destructive, realities. And so by 1916, there had been no breakthrough. The war was still raging, and Germany would return to unrestricted submarine warfare. And that return to unrestricted submarine warfare in 1916 and 1917 really began to pull the United States closer and closer to war, as it began targeting shipping, targeting merchant vessels, and so forth. The U.S. entry into the war occurs in 1917 officially, but it really developed for a couple years before that. Here you see Woodrow Wilson pictured here, the only American president to hold a PhD and former head of Princeton University. Germany, really out of desperation, felt in 1916 it had to resume unrestricted submarine warfare. They knew that in resuming unrestricted submarine warfare, this was going to pull the United States into war. We'd seen what had happened with the Lusitania. This policy would pull the United States into the war because they're going to target and affect neutral merchant shipping. So to avoid keeping the United States out of the war in a meaningful sense, the German foreign minister Zimmermann, sent a telegram to Mexico that was intercepted. And this telegram was designed to keep the U.S. out of war by encouraging Mexico to attack the United States. In exchange for their alliance with Germany, they would, after success in the war, would receive territories like Texas and California that had been seized in the Mexican-American War in the middle of the 1800s. This leads to the 1917 declaration of war by the United States. And the United States will play a very important role, particularly in terms of manpower and supplies, as well as fighting in battles like the Moose-Argonne Offensive. The United States will play an important role in ending the war on November 11th, 1918. During the war, and this is where we see some big issues in the United States come up. During the war, there are some huge questions about American civil liberties during wartime that really come to light. First of all, you have a overwhelming propaganda program in the United States, and this was headed by a guy named George Creel. And George Creel was the head of the Creel Committee, which was designed as a propaganda wing to promote support for the U.S. wartime policy. They censored publications that were critical of the war, and they promoted information that supported the U.S. war effort. And here you see a couple of examples of this type of propaganda. Germany and the Kaiser and their U-boats depicted as a dark, sinister sort of element here. And of course, here you have the characteristics of gender inequality during the time period here, where you have a female on a propaganda poster saying, "Gee, I wish I were a man so I could join the Navy," effectively, again, appealing to that sentiment that men become strong men by going in to fight wars. And this also speaks to the inherent gender inequalities in the United States at the time. Many do not know this, but this picture here is a picture of German nationals in an internment camp. Most Americans understand the Japanese internment, which occurred during the Second World War. But during the First World War, the United States also had an internment camp for German nationals. A German national means a German individual who is not an American citizen, but is living in the United States, and perhaps has been living in the United States for years in many cases. There was a program to, in many cases, and oftentimes with pretty flimsy evidence, in some cases stronger evidence, to arrest and in turn imprison for the war German nationals in the United States. And some 6,000 of them were interned in facilities like this. Now, this brings up a major question. First of all, should the United States during wartime be censoring publications? Should they be censoring publications and journals and newspapers? Should the United States be promoting the war with propaganda? Do Americans or nationals living in the United States, is their constitutional protections, their constitutional rights being infringed by an internment program? Does the United States have a constitutional right to imprison people simply because of their national identity? These are big questions for the United States at this time. The United States passed something called the Sedition and Espionage Acts, which was similar to an act passed under the presidency of the second president, John Adams, in the late 1790s, actually. The Sedition and Espionage Acts could result in imprisonment for free speech violation. So these are cases where people were given long terms, in some cases, of prison terms for speaking out against the war. And it doesn't mean necessarily inciting violence. It just means speaking out against the war. Eugene V. Debs, the famous socialist presidential candidate and labor organizer, gave a speech in Canton, Ohio. And Eugene V. Debs was imprisoned for it. And he wasn't inciting violence. He was just telling workers, he was saying socialist workers should not join the war effort because, in Debs' opinion, it was a war that was about profit for arms manufacturers. And he said, as a result of this, it's basically a war of capitalist aggression, and the United States should stay out of the war, and Americans shouldn't sign up for the war. And as a result of this, Debs was arrested, and he was tried under these acts, and he was imprisoned